Are remote-only companies freeloaders? You don't know what a tech workforce actually is and what tech unicorns have to do with advanced research. That and more today on Technically's inaugural State of the Local Tech Economies webinar. Hi, I'm Chris Wink. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Technical.ly, the news organization with a community of technologists and entrepreneurs. Yes, a man with as much sex appeal as the words webinar and LinkedIn Live. Thank you for being here. My job is to keep you engaged, so let's give it a try. Drop comments here if you're watching live on LinkedIn. I can see them and can use them to keep the conversation spicy, which is what we want. So if you look me up here, you will see me checking out your comments. It's December 2023, which means Technically has released our inaugural State of the Local Tech Economy reports. We follow each of the 5 U.S. Mid-Atlantic markets. Those reports have data, stories, and the people we technically believe best represent the tech economies of Baltimore, Delaware, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Washington, D.C. If you haven't already, you ought to download them. Who knew a PDF on tech workforce could be so much fun? Today, though, we're going to take what those places have taught us and what Technically reporting can tell us about how local tech economies around the country are faring and increasingly around the world. To do that, I'll be joined in a few minutes by economic development execs from a trio of places. But first, as Technically CEO and publisher, I'm here to give you a grounding in where that work stands right now. So I want to do that with a story, as many of you know I like to do. So in summer 2013, 3 high school friends from Maryland's Montgomery County took $25,000, rented a motel room in the heart of Silicon Valley, and began coding a tool to predict how members of Congress would vote on upcoming legislation. In 4 months, back in 2013, they raised a $1.3 million seed round with checks from First Round Capital and Mark Cuban, who allegedly responded to a cold email in 45 minutes and agreed to terms over the ensuing weekend. What a time it was. After closing the round and tired of sharing a motel room bed, the 3 moved back home to the DC region, where they were much closer to the customers for their evolving policy tracking software. 2 years later, we at Technically were reporting on what was that company's now called Fiscal Note's $10 million Series C, with a staff of 100 and a new 20,000 square foot office in downtown DC. The first generation of web businesses in many tech ecosystems were largely in the suburbs, in this case, Northern Virginia. And those that had developed in the early 2000s were mostly like vendors and agencies, not necessarily technology producers, technology service providers in the whole. In contrast, Fiscal Note was building a real patentable bit of software. They were a DC tech darling, and Ivy League educated 20-something founder CEO Tim Wang was a perfect avatar for what had become a major economic development strategy around the country. Attract and retain the smartest young people your home city can get. Encourage them to start tech startups, preferably ones that play into your existing region's strengths, and let them grow, baby, grow. They're going to hire and recruit smart people. They'll take up office space. They'll host events. They'll invest in culture and amenities for their workers, which will benefit others. Mayors and senators and governors took big scissors to ribbons in new sleek tech startup offices. The tech economy was going to solve it all. Over the next few years, Fiscal Note kept growing and became a very credible and serious suite of software for legislators, lobbyists, and the like. All told, they raised $650 million in venture financing. They acquired a dozen companies, and the pandemic boom accelerated it. Fall 2021, they got valued at $1.3 billion, becoming a tech unicorn, which so many of your ecosystems had been pursuing over the last 10 to 15 years. Then they went public. This is the dream. This is what we talked about 15 years ago. Start companies that were building software in our communities, let them grow big, create wealth, and the like. So a year ago, when they went public, they're worth just shy of $1.5 billion. Today, the company, which trades in the New York Stock Exchange, has a market cap closer to 150 million, a tenth as much. This isn't a story about what went wrong with Fiscal Note. In truth, it remains a strong and serious business. The point is that this story tells us something about where tech economies were in comparison to where they had been for the decade before and where we technically think they're heading next. So let me breeze through some data and then we'll set up our conversation. That'll be informed by the reports that you can download now. A bit on terminology. This will be familiar to many of you here. Us at Technically have often used these terms interchangeably. Innovation, startup, tech, community, ecosystem, economy. For these reports, we used the phrase tech economy, which refers both to the entrepreneurs and technologists inside information technology, inside the tech industry, and the workers across all industries, plus the research, infrastructure, and community that comes with it. To do that assessment, we at Technically increasingly use a matrix that looks like this. We include invention, where the research and development drives, commercialization, how we build businesses outside and off that research, the development, the workforce that makes it possible, lifestyle. Does anyone want to live where you are? And the reputation. Does anyone know what your community is about? And small aside, 15 years into this reporting, I've found that matrix helped me a bit better understand what ecosystem building looks like. And it looks something like this. Our communities started very much at the top of this iceberg. How our communities began were often we found service providers, software builders, contractors, tech workers coming together. And over time, the last decade, you guys all did this work to grow entrepreneurship communities, to talk about how financing strategies will let those companies grow. Increasingly, we're finding people talking about their R&D communities, the university tech transfer, private sector R&D, and overall workforce, which we found many of your communities have gotten down to. What is the future pipeline of workforce? I want to breeze on these topics for setting us up for the conversation. A note on research and development. One way to understand technology is to view it as applied commercialized science. Researchers at Johns Hopkins invent a process that leads to the spacecraft landing on an asteroid. University of Delaware researchers invent a process to create stronger glass. It's later implemented into the iPhone. Researchers at the University of Pennsylvania spend a career exploring mRNA, and then later it's implemented into life-saving COVID vaccines that won Katalin Kariko and Drew Weissman the Nobel Prize this year. All that research both solved real problems and generated wealth, and that's typically our image of research, what I know many of you think of, researchers at an academic institution. But I think funny thing is that's not where most research and development happens. It happens in the private sector. 3/4 of R&D happens at the private sector. But we care about R&D, and I think all of our ecosystems and our economies must care about the broad lens of research, because academic research still is where breakthrough technologies come from. It's where a lot of open sharing comes from. And the relationship between academic research, private sector research, and our tech economies, our tech ecosystems need to be tighter. If you total the 5 largest R&D spenders at the academic level, which includes Hopkins and Penn, Baltimore's Hopkins, Philadelphia's Penn, those 5 combined R&D budgets wouldn't be in the top 20 of private sector spenders. So one takeaway quickly I'll give you, ecosystem folks, if you don't know who your private sector R&D spenders are, you need to learn them, because it is where a lot of your R&D work is happening. You just might not know it because they tend to not share as much as our academic friends. Note the comparison between, and the trend is certainly continuing. Note the comparison between Amazon HQ2, which many of you worked on, where one private sector company squeezed 200 regions to put a bid together. Compare that with the EDA Tech Hubs effort that many of you have worked on this year, which includes a consortium, university, ecosystem, private sector workforce. So we're watching ecosystem is no longer just bidding one company to bring 50,000 jobs. We're seeing the importance of ecosystem is about what's the future of workforce. There's a lot of criticisms of large federal subsidy, but I think the point here is that this is pretty transformative stuff for tech ecosystems, as Richmond, Virginia, Baltimore, and Philadelphia, Delaware know, being involved in the tech hubs next stage. All right, a couple points on workforce I want to touch on. Before that, you all know entrepreneurship is booming, and it wasn't for many years. I think this is important for us to know for our ecosystem, but there's a few points here that I think we should set up. One, I'll point out that though it's booming and though it's becoming a lot more diverse, entrepreneurship seems to be splintering into two categories. We are finding those companies that can and will and want to grow to solve the biggest needs and opportunities, but an increasing range of companies, particularly companies from founders who represent demographics, more diverse founders, they're focused on sole proprietorships and much smaller vendor scale. That's better seen as a workforce extension. Entrepreneurship that's staying small, the service providers, the vendors, and the sole proprietorships are essentially workforce. We're hearing from employers that increasingly they're competing with people who are starting their own companies or their small consulting practices. That's a workforce question, which means I want to turn to a couple workforce points before diving into our conversation. Many of you I know in the room have felt the big tech clawback. Oh, gee golly, all of these layoffs. It's worth noting that when you plot tech employment nationally, we're just reverting back to where we once were. We're back to the trend line pre-pandemic. I see your comment there. Let me pull that up for a sec. So we collapsed in tech employment right at the midst of the pandemic. Then we boomed, as we all saw in 21, 2022. The collapse of the last year is just bringing us back closer to the trend line we were in, though we're actually still above it. So tech sector employment is still vital and necessary for your regions, and it will remain so. Speeding along because I want to jump to our conversation in a second. We technically have tracked that real rebound in job openings around September reversed. So basically from fall 2022 to about August, early September of 2023, that was where all those tech jobs got erased. They're beginning to come back. How much is active hiring, though, is an open debate. A couple notes on the remote work conversation naturally. Tech hubs still in metro centers. Cities matter. Most recent location quotient data from BLS, May 2022, still heavily dense in and around city centers because, though we talk about remote work, as I'll say in a second, it's not gone as big as many of us imagine it. I want to touch also on diversity. Diversity of tech workforce is a big effort from many of you. This happens to be DC area chart, but this is actually pretty common across our markets right now, which is we are seeing progress in the diversifying of tech workforce. It's happening. And I think for many of you who have spent a decade on this work and we were pulling our hair, you're like, how is it possible we're not making progress? Well, we are, but it depends on which roles you look at. If you look overall at tech occupations, you can begin to see, and this is very different than where we were 10 years ago, tech roles, tech occupations across the industry are looking closer to our population demographics. This is pulled DC Metro's MSA and DC's tech workforce. And it's similar, Philly, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and Delaware. DC Metro is better than everyone else in representation, but everyone's on this track. But the highest value jobs are having less progress. In this case, software development. So we see much more misalignment in software development, particularly for Black and Hispanic residents. That's the real key demographic. That's the real key job. So we are seeing diversification progress in tech roles, but they're ranging in topics. Remote work, we inevitably have to touch on it here before I set up our conversation. The latest numbers from Gallup, and then to the left, you see from Technical.ly's tech workforce dashboard. Basically, a quarter of remote capable jobs are fully remote. It's a giant change from where we were in 2019. That puts about 10% of the average metro's region. 10 to 15% on the high end of all workers are fully remote. That means 2/3 or more are at least hybrid. So the matching of workforce to place still matters. So for tech economy, when you're talking about workforce, it still is people going to an office sometime, but that is heavily skewed by larger employers. So we are really interested in what our growth stage tech companies are doing because it's predictive of what the next generation of big companies will do. And it's obviously worth noting, as many of you will note, pretty much every metro in the region is still below their pre-pandemic level of activity in their downtown core. That when you combine tourists, locals, workers, everyone's still below. This is from Center City District's Downtown Rebounds report. And one big concern that our commercial real estate friends are pointing out to us is we still got a lot of lease space that's coming up for renewal in the next 18 months, particularly in our big metro regions. It's true in DC, it's true in Philly, it's true in Baltimore. Pittsburgh is true to a little bit slightly lesser extent, but we do know that this is still an open question for what companies will renew lease space and how much that'll impact the activity downtown. This is still playing out because of how leases work. And I think my last macro point here, I'm obsessed with this. Many of you guys will know this. We should be paying attention. We know Americans are moving south and southwest. The cities and the regions that have combat that have tended to keep and attract young college graduates, particularly millennials, because it's a big population and a big generation, I should say. and attracted immigrants. Immigrant is going to be a dominant conversation in tech economies. If you're not talking about your attraction of immigrants, work with H-1B visas and the like, you are falling behind. This is a vital part of where tech economies are going. But I think it's worth saying in a big way, we know where the global population is going. We are told by 2100, the world population will be declining. Boomers and millennials are likely the largest human populations maybe ever. It may be the last big populations. And so I think for our cities and regions that are not growing as much, there might be an opportunity. I'm actually thinking specifically about the Pittsburgh community as an opportunity to say, we know where the global population is going. We are one of the brainiest mid-sized cities in the country, and we're figuring out what declining population growth means in a different growth environment. Those are big opportunities, which is going to bring me back to the final point on unicorns. We did this story on how many tech unicorns in the DC region are likely a mirage. They're on paper still listed as unicorns because their last valuations put them at above $1 billion valuation. But when you look at Fiscal Note, a strong company, I want to come across, I'm not criticizing Fiscal Note. I think they're representative of something important, that they're worth now in the public markets 1/10 of where they were just a year ago. That's an incredible change. So many tech unicorns are likely not valued where they were a year or more ago, which means our relationship to tech unicorns is likely time to put it aside. That likely was a chapter of the 2010s, the idea of private companies getting so big. And instead, we should think about what they need to care about, which is whether they will open offices, whether they will hire locally, what their relationship will be to local tech economies, and importantly, whether they'll be involved in advanced research. Because we tend to find when companies get big enough, they start spinning out great research. They create things in a way that's hard to do at a very small level. And so I'll close with two other unicorns that we followed for many years. These are Philadelphia examples. GoPuff, which is several years older than the DBT Labs team below. GoPuff still has a pretty big physical footprint in multiple cities, given that it's a logistics company, but its main headquarters in Philadelphia is far less used than it was supposed to be. Here's DBT Labs that has an office in Philadelphia, but is likely not going to renew it. We're told from private those involved, though I'd love to be corrected, get in the chat. These companies might not have as big a footprint for the future of our cities, which means if the 2010s were about entrepreneurs as they were, entrepreneurs will remain mightily important, but the 2020s may be the decade of tech workers, where they live, how they use technology, what they will learn and create, which is a way for understanding why the tech economy has to not just be focused on the entrepreneurs like we did in the 2010s, but has to be about a broader ecosystem. That's a snapshot. I went over, I apologize there, on where we were in tech economies today. We have fresh reports from a few markets that I want you to download and consume. But we're gonna have a conversation now with three experts to dig in to what we've heard. I'm gonna call up here to the stage Zakiya Ali, the executive director at Tech Council Delaware, Tempest Carter, director of guys, thanks for being here.
Great to be here. Hello.
Appreciate that. So, all right, would love to start with some initial reaction, either your home market report, anything you heard just now, anything that you were surprised by or just felt needs to be corrected?
I think it was really interesting looking at the trajectory of the startup going from almost a boom to almost a bust, but not a bust, going public and starting to see in what ways are we seeing that in the Philly market, particularly, around GoPuffs, around our larger unicorn companies, and even our larger, telecommunications programs, firms. So it's really interesting and a bit scary to see how these trends will affect not only the real estate market in Philadelphia, but the broader ecosystem. As there are continual layoffs, what will the entrepreneurial landscape look like post? And, this era of the tech worker versus the tech founder is going to be very interesting to figure out how can we nurture that and make sure that the soil is as fertile for the tech worker as it has been for many founders.
Sean, one of the many things I love about you is you'll always tell me when I'm a dummy. What did I get totally wrong? What needs to be corrected, or what stood out to you about any of this?
I think what's really, I'm a real estate guy by my long ago background. And so the intersection between the innovation ecosystems as the fuel for the real estate industry is really interesting to me, because for all three of our cities, the real estate industry is also a leading indicator of neighborhood health. And so, how do we continue to invest in our cities if we don't have the private sector folks delivering the office space, and they can't do that if no one's in the buildings? But the one thing that stood out to me kind of in contrast, as you were talking about GoPuff, is our major unicorn in Pittsburgh, obviously, is Duolingo, who just announced that they are taking additional office space in our East Liberty neighborhood. And we were really nervous. I was really nervous about Duolingo pre-pandemic, because they were ramping up their hiring in big tech hubs. It's no secret that Pittsburgh has a disadvantage when you're talking about competing for the top innovation talent, which is who Duolingo kind of commands on their workforce. But we've seen some slowing in their New York and I think closure of their Seattle offices as those operations went remote. But the back office, the community hub, the cultural center is still in Pittsburgh. And so we're seeing them not just expand their real estate footprint, but also their investments in cultural and civic anchors in the East Liberty neighborhood as well.
Zaki, I actually can pull you in, but encouraging folks to get in the chat, because I'm following what you have. And I just want to drop this Danielle Austin Launchpad, a great workforce program. Actually, it makes an interesting point that we have been reporting on it technically, that there was this deal that all of your markets implicitly had. Tech companies were given a kind of exalted status in many of our cities and regions in the 2010s. And there was this deal that, yeah, you're building software that can be anywhere, but because your workers are riding buses and in transit and bicycle and investing in amenities and on nonprofit boards and bringing kids in to visit your offices, there was a kind of civic output. There was an externality to them being there. And many of you know that we Technical.ly have found many of those founders were genuine about that investment in community. Some of them were not. Some of them were focused on, hey, I need to attract talent, and this is what I have to do in the 2010s is I have to have a cool startup office space and need to have programming and events. And I think right now we're watching who's still investing in communities and who's like, well, cool, I don't have to do that anymore. And Zaki, I guess I'm kind of curious. You've been in a lot of ecosystems. You have a lot of experience. You're now at the Tech Council of Delaware. Just kind of talk to me a little bit about what stood out to you, or what has changed in how these tech economies are how your Delaware relationship is compared to ones in the past.
Yep. Thank you for that, Chris. Very different being in the Delaware market than being in the Philadelphia market. I think for what I saw in the report, two big things really stood out. Some of the areas where we received a C on this report card, of course, I go right to, what wasn't that great. I think have a lot to do with sort of what we as leaders can do in our tech ecosystem. One, to create better climates, both for technologists and also for our startup communities. I think that was one piece that was kind of confirm what we know already, even though there is some great work happening. So there's a leadership component that we have to address if we want to be considered a major tech hub in this country, and we not get overlooked on this, as you point out in the report, a vital Eastern corridor hub. We have New York, we have Philly. Folks leapfrog over Delaware and jump right to DC and Baltimore and Virginia. And we play a vital part here too. So there's another storytelling component. There's a perception component about what value does Delaware add, not just on the East Coast, but nationally. So we're working to, one, mobilize our leaders in a different way. That's what the Tech Council is really formed to do, build that strong ecosystem, be a big umbrella for everyone. Not an easy job, because we do have some siloed approaches here in the state that keep a lot of great work happening kind of in one-offs. But how do we come together and do it as a state, as a collective unit, and be part of what is going on in Philadelphia? We're part of their metropolitan statistical area. We shouldn't compete for grant opportunities. So I was very, happy to see that we are designated as a tech hub for precision medicine in partnership with Philadelphia. We have received funding for clean hydrogen. And so with those types of opportunities come the opportunities to invest in our workforce in a different way. So segue and switching to that, we want to make sure that as your report pointed out, people start to see that there are cool jobs in tech here in Delaware. So again, a perception issue. How do we showcase that a bit more? It's not all about banking and finance. They are a great staple here in Delaware, but we have tech in advanced manufacturing, we have tech in healthcare, we have tech in energy, and we want to highlight all of the great stuff that's happening in Delaware as well. One last piece to what Danielle put in the comments is that the Tech Council of Delaware launched a summer internship program that had high school students doing work-based learning 5 days a week, 2 days in the classroom working with our training provider, Code Differently, 3 days on site in some of those diverse industries that we talked about. None of them were just with tech companies. They're with companies that have great tech jobs and opportunities. So we're really proud of the leaders that stepped up and said, we're not going to keep complaining about the fact that we can't find and develop good tech employees and workers. We're going to invest in doing that at the high school level. Last spicy piece, Chris. How dare you all leave us out of the top stories of 2023 in Delaware? It's been a long time coming to have a tech council in Delaware. 2 gubernatorial administrations, both the Markell administration and the Carney administration. My team and I came in a matter of months, got this ship going in the right direction, mobilized people. We've been kicking and taking names for some time now. And so we deserve to be acknowledged for the great work that we do and the value we add to our state's ecosystem.
I very much appreciate that. And everyone, you can know behind the scenes, when we got in the green room, I said, please tell me everything we got wrong in this report. Because as you'd appreciate, if you guys haven't, download them in each of our markets, report card with a mix of qualitative and quantitative data. And it only matters if we call it out a bunch, because it means we're trying to say something new, which I think we are. Let's turn to what has changed. Because as it was pointed out to me, though we're trying to set this as, or let me rephrase it, this will be an annual addition to the Technical.ly calendar. Each year, each December, we'll kind of recap that ecosystem's year. But this naturally, because it was the first, kind of became a where were we before the pandemic and where are we now? It's like a little bit of a benchmark, at least in the narrative that's coming out of the report for us. So I'm kind of curious what you guys are seeing as different today than where you were in 2019. Sean, I can remember the first time I met you, I believe, was you were doing a presentation at one of the hotels, maybe it was at Kimpton in East Liberty, for, I think, coming out of a Brookings report in 2017, 2018, I think. So I'm curious, turn to you first. Where is Pittsburgh in 2023 versus 2018, 2019, and what might other markets learn from or see in themselves?
Well, I guess to start with the least replicable piece, to continue biding time to come up with a better answer than that. I think the biggest change is that we are accepting that level 5 autonomy in cars is not happening as fast as we thought it was.
Interesting. Yeah.
So, the pre-pandemic story of Pittsburgh was around AV. And, is that essentially transitioning the center of automotive innovation from Detroit and Michigan to Western Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh? And I think what we're seeing in the trends is that we're not all going to be driving level 5 autonomous cars as fast as we thought. But and that resulted in a lot of companies going down over the past year as their venture backing figured that out. $billion-dollar valuations essentially written off by multinational automotive manufacturers. But we're seeing a tremendous amount of strength in the autonomous fleet space and the autonomous freight space. And so we are seeing the ashes of those really exciting companies from 2018 really pivot or wholesale be reformed already with, again, multi-$100-million investments pivoting into that freight space. But I do think the biggest thing that's interesting for us is, what is a Pittsburgh company? If your founder is from Pittsburgh, but they live in Austin, are they a Pittsburgh company? If they're getting Keystone Innovation Zone tax credits, but only the founder lives here and the workforce is in North Carolina, should they be eligible for those tax credits? We have a really strong brand. And in some ways, we need to be protective of that, but also not smothering out people kind of going where they need to go to get the investment and the talent that they need to compete on an international stage.
There's a lot in there. Kind of Tempest is a key. Another way to think, well, do either of you have any gut reaction to like where your respective community is today as opposed to where it was before the pandemic?
Yes, absolutely. The physical nexus of the hub of tech in Philadelphia has dispersed. In 2019 and pre-pandemic, when you would look on a map and say, where is tech happening? Where's the growth? Where are, businesses growing and setting up shop and cool tech office spaces? It was Old City primarily. And even 3rd Street was renamed Nerd Street, for Nerd Street Gamers, local host. And now they're on North Broad Street. Other people are have moved over to Spring Garden or have gone completely remote. It's kind of disbursement. And you also see that with beautiful Class A office space going up all around the city, primarily in like University City with the CIC building and other buildings similar. The Navy Yard has been built up in many ways, and so you just see a physical disbursement of companies. And I think that is something that's different. And what is the impact of that, right? When everyone is kind of situated in a smaller, footprint, you have a lot more connection in terms of a general culture, events, programming, and supports that they give to each other. Of course, during the pandemic, so many of those programming offerings, died down or went fully, online. And now it's sort of, people are coming back together, some with my tech talk that I host with the city of Philadelphia with the Commerce Department, others with One Philadelphia with the Innovation Weekend. Folks are coming back together, but it's slow work.
Actually, Tim, it's really interesting. And Zakiya, I'm going to turn to you, but like you made connected for me, Sean, you can fact check me. I know the Pittsburgh story less well in this specific point, but I can say DC, Baltimore, Philly, at least, and I think a glimmer of Wilmington. I would bet there's some glimmer of this at Pittsburgh. But when we look back at the .com crash, that summer 2001 clawback, where all of those 1990s gain of the internet economy was erased in public markets, there was a complete collapse in venture financing. There was a real change in realism of what eyeballs meant for internet companies. When we look back in our reporting, something happened geographically at that collapse, that almost all of the tech economies were suburban. It was Northern Virginia, it was Towson and Baltimore County, it was Western suburbs in Philadelphia. And then something happened in the early 2000s where each of those markets, at least, there was a little gaggle of, small entrepreneurs. They often had like software consulting firms. They were building small web applications, started hanging out. It was very socially in urban cores. And that began to grow momentum. And then we started seeing like a millennial generation stay in cities. And that got us the 2010s, where cheap money and other trends brought us tech ecosystems largely in urban cores, which was not the narrative of the 90s at all. Tempest, you make me think how much right now is a reversal of that or just a slowdown? It just got disrupted and things will reassemble. Zakiya, that might be an unfair question to throw to you, but I'm just kind of curious if you've seen anything in that in like the Delaware narrative of like where geographically the center of gravity is, to pick up Tempest's point.
Yeah, I think in Delaware, certainly Wilmington and our top county, Newcastle County, is our anchor county and city for tech in Delaware. Doesn't mean that we don't have tech in other counties, but Wilmington is that. And I think one of the things that's much different now that leads to us having a more vibrant tech community is that we have a riverfront that's been built up. We have lots of new high-end apartments. We have some affordable housing coming up. We know that there's a housing crisis nationally, but at least now we have a physical location where people from JP Morgan, Barclays can come and hang out from the tech community and have a place in a space that feels exciting in some ways. So I think that's something that both young people and mid-career professionals will always want, is that physical place that looks like tech and feels hip. I think that's what you're kind of speaking to, is that vibe of tech started to shift, and it became more of how do we, engage, whether it's happy hours, networking sessions, panel events, videos, all the cool stuff that makes tech feel a bit more urban and young, I think is happening in Wilmington as well. We didn't have Tech Thursdays in 2019. We now have a series of tech meetups in Delaware that we didn't have before. We have our leading company, JP Morgan Chase, that hires and employs the largest number of tech workers in the state, was the first organization to step up and say, hey, let's do a seminal research document to figure out how we get a council even established. So having your anchor institution step up and play that role in the ecosystem, I think, is super important. We also have a broadband office that's coming in and doing some fabulous things related to making sure that our residents have the tech skills that they need to thrive and succeed, both civically and economically. We're realizing that every job is a tech job. So we're not narrowing ourselves just to big tech companies or just to the startup community. We're looking at all occupations and jobs across the state, and how do we make sure that we have a workforce that can fill those positions and make Delaware overall a lot more economically sound and advanced.
Can I go back to Sean? You mentioned something that I'm going to throw this big old question from my colleague Samir. Samir, it's so many damn words, doesn't even fit in the screen. So I'm just putting this to prompt. Samir is getting at how much are you guys resetting the narrative of your home community? And Sean, when you talked about, hey, we had an incredibly successful Pittsburgh narrative in the 2010s. In our report, I did a panel of people who weren't in any of your markets and talked about how they viewed each of your markets. Pittsburgh has a very high remarks from an outside community. And I think that 2010 narrative around autonomous vehicles, robotics really hit, and it really helped advance robotics, the robotics narrative. Are each of you guys feeling a post-pandemic, what is our narrative now moment, or does that feel already set? And yeah, I see some heads, so let's get the round of answer. But Sean, I'll go with you.
Yeah, I think yes, no, and yes. So, one, I think we're pushing back on the idea that our robotics ecosystem was exclusively driving, pun intended, towards autonomous vehicles, and really reinforcing the amount of hardware technologies that continue to be developed. And, the Pittsburgh Robotics Network has a map of like 138 robotics companies doing production, R&D, or innovation on the ground in Pittsburgh. So we are surviving that pivot for sure. I think we are really interested in how to better tie Pittsburgh into the development of an AI ecosystem, generative AI, obviously, but more broadly, that tech is coming out of Carnegie Mellon University. But we are not seeing the local adoption or the same narrative attachment as we see in hardware robotics. And so I'm struggling to understand kind of what it is that San Antonio, Texas, of all places, has that's allowing them to really capture that energy. And I think our narrative needs to embrace that more aggressively before we lose our competitive advantage. And then, you were snarky and focused on all the Tech Hub Award winners and didn't focus on the Build Back Better Award winners like Pittsburgh. But we did not get our Tech Hub designation. And our Tech Hub was built around life sciences and biomanufacturing in particular. And since then, we've seen almost $200 million worth of investments in a broad spectrum of life sciences companies, not just cell and gene therapy companies, but health tech companies, AI integrated companies, but also those more what we call basic science, life science folks that you would expect to see coming out of Tempus, Rolodex, and Philadelphia. Yep. And so we're trying to figure out what is Pittsburgh's tech hub in the biospace? And do we need to get really specific, or can we be successful as a generalist in that space and understand that when you're the number 4 recipient of NIH investments in the country, that builds a broader, more basic Center for Innovation and Biotechnology than being really targeted and really deep.
I'm going to to pick up that and give you something for all you guys to hit on. I appreciate, Sean, again, let it be known, we technically appreciate all the pushback, because you actually said an interesting thing. All three of your markets, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Delaware, but frankly, also DC Metro, also Baltimore, also many of the communities I'm sure represented on this LinkedIn Live, are suddenly up for a lot of federal funding. And there's a big conversation about whether that's good or not. I'm not going to wade into the economic strategy of whether we think industrial policy is efficient policy. That's for your economics seminar elsewhere. But I'm kind of curious how much, like in the 2010s, I think the Amazon HQ2 thing is a very neat narrative, that the big economic development strategies around tech in the 2010s were like, good golly, will Google open an office here? Will Facebook please acquire some company and keep the office up? That's all the coverage that we were seeing in the 2010s. And now this federal industrial policy around, we're going to really bolster advanced research, advanced manufacturing, is something new and novel. I'm kind of curious how much you guys see that as now part of your ecosystem building.
Huge.
Any of you, you're all, please, Tempest.
Huge. That's a game changer for us. I mean, we're with the EDA funding, the Greater Philadelphia, Delaware, New Jersey coalition. We're up for $75 million, up to $75 million flowing into our various, our various cities, and it has a huge impact. When you look at companies like BioLattice, which, has been trying to get their kind of first money in, Black woman-owned life science company, and we're able to connect them to the Enterprise Center pitch competition with Most Diverse Tech Hub funds. They're able to get their first $80K. Imagine what you're able to do with federal dollars coming in and flowing into the ecosystem, in particular for precision medicine and advanced life sciences. That is just a game changer for us, because not only do the big fishes eat in that scenario, but all of the sort of smaller companies and companies that support those larger firms really have access, hopefully, to more capital and the ability to grow.
Yeah, certainly we think that, federal investments will also be game changers, if you will. One of the first projects I worked on, even before I fully relocated and started in this role, was to lead the Good Jobs Challenge project here in Delaware. So we went after about $14 million for the Good Jobs Challenge grant. We did not get it, which was not surprising to me. But what the project did do was it allowed us a specific vehicle to mobilize all of our partners to say, if we want to compete for these types of funds, we've got to work better together. So we're back to our leadership component. Can we get together and do this in a way that we have an investable system? By the time we finish that project, after about 6 months, we have a sectoral partnership called First State Tech Partnership. So while we may not necessarily be the lead or have been part of the applicant group, either for the EDA Tech Hubs or the Mid-Atlantic Clean Hydrogen Project, what we can do is to be a partner in that workforce space. So we have partners at the table that can get the message out to residents about great tech opportunities. We have institutions of higher education in our boot camps that can train those folks for all of these jobs. So no matter which federal initiative it is, the government is saying that there needs to be an equity and diversity lens on making sure that the workforce is representative of the populations where all these investments are being made. So that's the change agent that has to happen. Great investments in industry, great investments in technology broadly, but we have to make sure that those workforces look like the populations where those investments are being made. And that's what the Tech Council can bring to all of those initiatives. Further, when we talk about the perception piece of it, we do think storytelling is very important. That's that third goal we have. We want to change the perception and narrative about Delaware that people have. We're not all beaches. We're not all credit cards. We're not all chickens for our, manufacturing hubs downstate. We want to make sure that folks know what tech looks like here in Delaware, what makes us different. And we have to combat some of the same narratives other big cities do related to crime, housing affordability and access, as well as the child care and the K-12 education systems. If you want families to relocate, All of those things have to be addressed, including public transportation. We don't have a rail system here in Delaware, so it makes it difficult, even in a small state, to get across all 3 counties. So those are things we know have to be addressed. But our storytelling campaign in partnership with Technical.ly is going to highlight all of the positive aspects of tech in Delaware and really make it clear what makes us a destination for big tech companies, any type of companies with tech jobs, tech workers, and federal investments.
Sean, one of the many reasons Pittsburgh's always interested me, you guys are half leg in the Midwest, a strong leg in the East Coast. You are, shake your head or not, you are the natural leader for Pennsylvania. I say that even sitting here in Philadelphia, and you're tethered into Maryland by virtue of your own geography. Like, you could span a lot of places. How much are you viewing the federal policy, as you alluded to, as like part of the next decade of what Pittsburgh's tech economy looks like?
So the only caveat I want to put on that is I think what we're seeing with Build Back Better is there's a difference between investments at the ecosystem level, which we're an ecosystem builder. So obviously I'm a believer in that. But that doesn't mean that we have $80,000 checks to write for the companies like Tempest was describing. The Build Back Better investments are at the systemic level at an 11 county, which is a giant area. Versus what we're seeing with the Intel plant in Columbus, which is a ton of federal money matched with a ton of state money going into a specific project. And so I think Pittsburgh versus Central New York versus Central Ohio is going to be a really interesting example of the different types of industrial policy that are playing out right now. And this is a more 21st century example of make the investments up front and see what happens versus some of the big chip investments, the big manufacturing investments that we're seeing, frankly, more Southeast US, is going back to your map on that population change, Chris. And I think it's just going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. But to your point about Pittsburgh's geography, part of our narrative is developed because we are just far enough away from the other tech hubs, especially on the East Coast. So, we have seen our Amazon, our Apple, our Facebook, our Microsoft offices all grow. And I think if we were any closer, frankly, to Northern Virginia or New York, those investments would have been diffused into the mothership.
Yep.
We are far enough away from Chicago that these are defined and very separate ecosystems. The disadvantage of that is, Tempest was just here a couple of weeks ago. She had to get here in a 15 passenger van on the turnpike. We've got to figure out how to knit this network of genuinely very successful, but very Midwest tech hubs with Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Delaware, and Philadelphia, because I think collectively we offer something different than California. We offer something different than Boston, different than South Florida. And I think that we are better together if we can figure out how to do that without being directly competitive with each other.
I want to actually wrap us here in a minute or so, but a few points that you guys are calling out, and you see it across the State of the Tech Economy reports, and I think a lot of Technical.ly's coverage. There is a big national level conversation that we're going to have around how diffuse should tech economies go. In the 2010s, there was a lot of cheerleading for, we want to see Silicon Valley's wealth generating machine distribute across the country. And there are plausible reasons. We want diversity of regions because, if anything, you just want a diversity of company creation, diversity of wealth creation. You want redundancy in the system. That's a core philosophy that makes sense. But at some point, you spread out too far, we lose what we know density gets us, which is the serendipity that we all think cities are good at, what research centers are very good at. And I think a lot of our coverage at Technical.ly is trying to understand that balance. How pervasive can tech economies be in all markets? Now, I think present company here is still like dense enough. I think it's probably a safe bet that this is going to be part of the conversation. But I guess I'm curious here. Are you guys questioning in any way that you didn't in 2019 about the importance of local ecosystems? workforce meeting each other, entrepreneurs meeting each other, going to hang out in-person events. We've watched rise of remote work, companies that can do stuff virtually. Do you still bet on real humans getting together in your space? And like, I mean, I see some nods, and actually, maybe I'll save it, Sean, to close out, because I think Sean would be most critical or push me in the right way. But Tempest, you got an enthusiastic nod. You're still betting on tech economies?
Oh, absolutely.
Local.
I think local. The more local, the better. I mean, I would love, part of my role is attraction. So, of course, I would love to attract mid-size and large tech companies into the region. However, I'm really about those founders that will, you know, be able to scale and, you know, close their first round, or, you know, look through conventional means to raise, you know, as the investment, you know, landscape changes. But I believe that Philadelphia has an acre of diamonds in its founders and its workers. And that if we get together and if we create, you know, as someone who works for the Commerce Department, if we continue to play a very active role in tilling the soil and making sure that it's as fertile as possible, that we're creating ease of access to capital and resource and TA, if we're able to do that, I think Philly wins. And I think that if Philly wins, the region wins, the state wins. But making sure that we do that through a lens of equity is pivotal, because if the wealth that's being created never touches North Philly, you know, never touches West Philly, you know, beyond 40th Street, it's not going to actually be transformative. So it matters with the asterisk.
Oh, good. You're muted, Chris, so I can just jump in. I strongly agree with that, like everything that Tempest said. And what I would add on top of that is many of our economies were originally built on resource extraction. So Pittsburgh is here because of geography, but it thrived because of what's underneath the geography, which is iron ore and coal and sand and all the things that we needed to build America. The thing that we have now that we figured out how to globalize steel production is you cannot move the University of Pittsburgh to South Carolina. You cannot move the intellectual capabilities of Carnegie Mellon University to the Southeast. And so the tech economy is critical in growing our, quote, Rust Belt, love it or hate it, tag cities, because that's the thing that we have, that we've continued to invest in for the last 250 years, that is the underlying driver of the tech economy. And so it's critical to create the way we can create a new wave of economic opportunity, to Tempest's point, is if we better capitalize on the investments and the brain power that are happening in the university ecosystem. And the tech economy, the life science economy, is how we can do that.
What's a good parting shot, Zakiya? I want to give you one final shot. You can evade this more difficult question, but one reason that Delaware has always interested me, how representative it is as the country as a whole, you know, put into small relief. An urban center in Wilmington, rural, suburban, beaches, and the like. You represent the entire state, and you might have insight that the rest of the country would be interested in. How much can you really have a tech economy in Smyrna, in Sussex County? Like, how far spread can you imagine it, or do you have to have a priority toward density?
Yeah, I think Wilmington will always be our anchor, but that's not to say that Kent and Sussex County don't matter. They absolutely do matter. And we see a lot of growth in tech jobs down there. We use our data dashboard to figure out where are those growing tech jobs. And it's actually in Kent and Sussex County, outside of banking, bio and life sciences, and finance, and fintech. It is actually happening in other pockets. The state of Delaware is also a large employer of tech talent in this state. And they're throughout the state of Delaware, not just in Wilmington. And so when we think about those growth sectors, we're thinking statewide, though we know Wilmington is and will always be the anchor for tech employment in Delaware. So we're never not going to take a statewide approach or focus to this work. The other piece is that we do believe that tech ecosystems matter, specifically as it pertains to the people and the workers. And that's the part we don't want to lose. We believe that if our workforce both, our K through 12 systems, our collegiate systems, and then the adult populations that are here in Delaware that can be upskilled to ensure that they have the digital, technology, and durable skills, as well as work experience, credentials, and certifications needed to thrive in any industry and any economy that's going to leverage all of those competencies. We think that will be a distinguishing factor for which companies decide to make Delaware home and which ones say, we're staying here and we're going to continue to invest in the people and grow here. And so that's the part that we're doubling down on. And so for the first time ever, we had a tech ecosystem conference where we brought our corporate members together. We brought our training providers, our community organizations, and the voice of the actual workers to the table. They have a place in our ecosystem as well. So we'll always bet on people. The stronger we are, the more skilled we are, I think the better we are.
Incredible. You make me want to give you a bit of summary as I close out here. There are reports in each of our communities. You should download them and consume them. We love a good PDF. But what is the state of local tech economies in the United States right now? Entrepreneurship is up, but splintering. We're seeing growth companies get into more regulated and advanced industries, and we're seeing it as a kind of workforce extension. I'm starting my small consultancy, and I might effectively be a kind of workplace addition. It's also likely contributing to our labor challenges. Tech jobs are above trend where they were in the pandemic. How those people organize locally is likely going to shape what tech ecosystems mean as entrepreneurship has shifted in a more remote environment where we're seeing a lot of companies start with a remote lens in a way that they didn't in the past. And industrial policy is going to play out over the next several years in a way that we thought VC did in the 2010s. Likely where our tech economies are shaped may be impacted a lot by industrial policy in a way that we haven't seen in the 15 years that Technical.ly has reported, because we've never seen this level of investment. That is a snapshot of the state of local tech economies. Thank you, Tempest, Sean, and Zakiya, for giving your own thoughts. We'll drop links for the full reports below, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.